Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Today, we are going to have one of our own, another appearance of Norma Graham talking about Bert Kennedy, but I'll let her get into all of that good stuff and why this is such a fascinating story. And it's got multiple levels and a little bit of a teaser for the future. So that said, if you aren't already, I know a lot of you already are supporting through Patreon or YouTube channel membership, please consider that to help me keep doing these things. And more of them, because I'd love to be able to do more and all that. And for those of you who watch Woody and on World War II TV, you know how much time and effort and everything these things take to get going and all that good stuff. So if you can support, please do. Also, just a quick reminder, there was a video released on, at least in Eastern time this morning, about looking at the ground actually at Verrier Ridge, where the Black Watch attack will have taken place in 5 days' time, 80 years ago. So it's really sweeping ground, and you can literally see I went as much as I could and covering that exact ground of where that happened. So check that out. And also, if you haven't seen it in the past, check out the David O'Keefe live stream where we talked exactly about the Black Watch. They're fighting in Normandy through to spring. So that's a good one to check out. So I will bring in Norma today. Norma, how are you?
Very well. Thanks, Brad. How are you?
Good. Finally got some nice stable weather here for the first time in a couple of weeks, so it's nice to have that, and already took advantage of that. So
good.
That's good. So I'm excited to have you on again, talking about another individual like we did before with McLeod before, which was great. So this one, it's I don't want to say different, but it's a story a lot of people don't really know, or they've seen it in passing from a certain book, and we will get to that, but. So you were looking at Bert Kennedy, and then just as a lot of people know I like to do is why this topic in particular?
Well, I am originally from Grey County. I presently live in Bruce County. So same area.
One over.
Southwestern Ontario.
Yeah.
If you're in England, say, where there's a very dense population, you draw a circle, 50 miles in diameter, you're going to find a lot of war heroes in that small space. But Canada, we're very spread out. But to go back to when I first discovered Bert Kennedy, I have an elliptical machine because old lady's got to keep him trim. And I was doing my elliptical one morning, and I always listen to audiobooks while I'm doing that. And I was listening to Mark Zwelka's book on Operation Husky. Yeah. And I heard him say that, talking about Sicily, that Bert Kennedy, who was the scion of an Owen Sound manufacturing family. And I went, Owen Sound? Hold the phone, because Owen Sound is just, it's quite near me.
Yep.
I thought, why don't I know anything about this guy? Yeah. If he's a war hero, essentially. So I started to look into it, and I enlisted the assistance of Dave Alexander, who you probably know, who's a local military historian. And we went on the hunt for Bert Kennedy. So with a lot of help from him and other folks, I did this whole project about Bert's war. He was really only in frontline action for 9 months, but as you know, 9 months in the front line as an officer is a long time. It's exhausting. So
especially his
so it was a pretty intense period. So I just found him incredibly interesting, and because he's local to me, I thought that's something that I should look into. So
that's there's the man of the hour, and I mean it's always great to have the local connection to get into these deeper stories, because again, as we'll get into his story, there's some twists and turns you don't expect.
No, that's for sure.
Particularly in his, it's anyway. We'll get into this.
Bert had a very interesting war.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, it's hard to describe without getting into the details.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the details. First of all, I want to say thanks to all the people who helped me with my research. That list is not not the whole list. I should also mention the volunteers at the Grey and Simcoe Foresters Museum and the volunteers at the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment Museum, who also provided assistance. So you can go on to the next one. Bert Kennedy was born in Owen Sound, Ontario in 1905. His great-grandfather had emigrated from Scotland in 1831 and established a foundry business in the Georgian Bay town in 1857, creating, among other necessary items, propellers for ships and boats. And you can see on the picture on the right there is one of the propellers that that factory built. Bert's father, David, continued in the family business, and Bert also did for a time. But he spent much of his spare time with the militia, specifically the local regiment, the Grey and Simcoe Foresters. Bert took advantage of many opportunities to hone his martial skills, taking courses in signals, artillery, and command. When war was declared in 1939, as commander of the Foresters, Kennedy began at once to assemble and train his men. Go back one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, getting ahead of me.
All right. We're going the wrong way.
Wrong way. There we go. Okay.
Sorry.
So the Canadian Army in 1940 was looking for officers to go overseas, and Kennedy took a demotion in rank to be eligible for overseas service. So he left the Grey Simcoe Foresters at this point and was sent to Toronto to join a holding company. With them, he traveled to England in 1940 and was posted to the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment as a major. The regiment from Eastern Ontario trained hard for the better part of 3 years until the time came for them to add their strengths to the war effort. Okay, next slide. So just a note about the structure of the Canadian Army for maybe viewers who don't know. Before the war began, the permanent force was, that is the regulars, the ones who, that was their career. Was comprised of 455 officers and 3,714 other ranks, not very many. The militia fielded 5,272 officers and 41,249 other ranks. But due to years of neglect and underfunding, the militias were not fully trained and had obsolete equipment, if they had any equipment at all. Even getting proper uniforms was a challenge, and men trained in their civilian clothes. Militia officers often donated their inadequate pay to their regiments to purchase supplies. Some of Canada's best leaders in the Second World War came from the militia, including Bert Hofmeister, Bruce Matthews, Ross Ellis, and I would argue, Bert Kennedy. Go ahead. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, as part of the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade of the 8th Army, left England in June of 1943 in a convoy of ships heading for Sicily for Operation Husky. En route, several ships were sunk by U-boats, including one that held about 500 of the Canadians' vehicles. When the Canadians arrived on July 10th to begin the amphibious assault at Pachino, they faced the reality that they were going to have to cross Sicily on foot, pretty much. So you can see, Brad's showing everyone down in the bottom, the very bottom corner, there's Pachino, which is where the Canadians made landfall. Next one. The campaign to wrestle Sicily back from the fascists began fairly well. Their landing was mostly unopposed. The Italians, having in the main lost any stomach, they might have had to fight for Il Duce. Amphibious landings tend to be difficult. That's kind of an understatement.
Yeah.
Many of the landing craft missed their landing marks. Kennedy, however, confidently commandeered and steered his landing craft and managed to land on the beach right on target. This gave Kennedy's D Company a head start, and they headed for the Pachino airfield, their first objective, which they shared with the Royal Canadian Regiment. Meeting some hostile fire from an Italian gun emplacement, Kennedy told the RCR's Slim Liddell that his men would assault it. With the help of RCR covering fire, Kennedy led the charge, and D Company took the fortified hill, capturing several guns and a number of prisoners. Next one. So he started strong. The Canadian regiments then began their hot, dusty, exhausting slog across Sicily, mostly on foot. The conditions were brutal. July in Sicily frequently tops 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The choking dust coats everything, and water that was safe to drink was very scarce. Malaria, hepatitis, which was called jaundice in the war diaries, and dysentery were rife. The terrain was rocky and steep, and the roads were poor. Men marched for hours, dropping into a deep sleep upon stopping for even a brief rest. It was horrendous. And once the Canadians headed north from the coast, they began to meet German troops, and the fighting truly began. Next slide.
Oops. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Hi, Susan. So on July 20th, so exactly 81 years ago, about now, 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade approached Asaro after some heavy fighting at Valguanera. 1st CIB was commanded to take Asaro from the occupying Germans, which is not an easy task given it was perched on a 3,000-foot high mountaintop. And I need to thank our friend Jason Giroux for the photographs that he shared with me of Asaro from the top and from the bottom. And as you can see, it's a formidable spot. And there's a quote there from Ross Monroe that you can read. So you're about to hear why he said that, why he said that it was the exploit of the Hastings at Asaro was the most daring and spectacular action in Sicily. Okay, next slide. There was great danger from the enemy in that position. In fact, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment commanding officer, Colonel Bruce Sutcliffe, was killed while doing reconnaissance some distance from the cliff. Lord Tweedsmuir thus became commanding officer and Bert Kennedy his second in command. The road up the mountain via the river valley and all reasonable approaches to Asaro were being watched by German gunners. It was decided that the Hasty Peas would take an irrational path straight up a sheer cliff in the middle of the night. So instead of going up through the river valley, they went up the back where nobody in their right mind would try and climb, and especially in the dark. But they did it anyway. Tweedsmuir often said afterwards that he was fortunate to lead men who had lived on farms and in villages in rural Ontario because they knew where to put their feet in the dark. It was an absolutely mad plan, but on the 20th of July, members of the Hasty Peas, carrying the bare minimum of equipment, performed what Farley Mowat called their own private miracle, making their way silently up the cliff face in the darkness. Now, this quote is from an unpublished memoir by Tweedsmuir. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you, Dave. So this is from his memoir, from John Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir's memoir. And you can see where he said, although he was pretty far gone, he grabbed my wrist and said, "John, for God's sake, don't go up that road." I don't think he spoke again. So he was giving them fair warning that they weren't going to go up the road. They weren't going to go through that direction. They were going to have to figure out a different way to get up. Okay, next one. In the morning light, the Canadians appeared as if by magic on top of the mountain, taking the Germans totally by surprise. The Hasty Peas took a German gun emplacement, and one of them noticed a binocular telescope that the Germans had been using to keep watch. And there's a photograph there of one of these types of telescopes. That item was to play a key role in what happened later that day. The German counterattack was not long in coming, and the Hasty Peas were pinned down on top of the cliff. Running out of ammunition with no water or food left, the situation was becoming desperate. Reinforcement was slow in coming because the enemy still had the other accesses covered. And that's when Bert Kennedy saved the day. With the telescope that had been scrounged from the German gun emplacement, and using the number 56 radio that had been carried up the cliff on a signaler's back, Kennedy put his artillery training from years before to good use. Next one. So this again is from Lord Tweedsmuir's memoir. He said that there were 3 miracles of Asaro, and Bert Kennedy was one of them. He wrote, here, and an infantry battalion was an ex-gunner who was word perfect in artillery communications. In that hour of mortal peril, Bert's artillery training returned to preserve us all. So do you want me to read this, or do you, I guess, I mean, if somebody's watching this on their phone, they're going to struggle to see.
Yeah, we'll just leave it there for a second, if that's okay.
Sure, good idea.
Check it out in the in the post, but also if you can read quick, you can look at it now. But yeah, and just jump in real quick. I'll also give you a break from talking for a second. Is we had I had Mark Zilke on talking about those 2 battles right at Asaro and Leonaforte. So you can check that out afterwards. Those really, we get into the details of, you know, the what, why, and how, and all that good stuff. If you want to learn more about this, particularly this part of the assault, because well, I know what's coming up here, but Farley Mowat talks about this quite a lot, multiple times.
Farley Mowat counts in the next hour, the regiment gave the distant Canadian artillery a series of dream targets. As each German gun fired up at Asaro, its position was radioed to the rear, and within minutes, salvos of Canadian shells fell upon it. That night, volunteers from the RCR managed to bring food, water, and ammunition up to the Hasty Peas, and by the end of day on July 22nd, the Germans retreated from Asaro. 8 Hasty Peas died in the assault on Asaro, but the number would have been much higher without Kennedy's quick thinking and ability to direct artillery. Lieutenant General Howard Graham said of Kennedy's action, this undoubtedly was an important factor in forcing the enemy to release his hold on both Leonforte and Asaro. More fighting took place before the Canadians left Sicily behind, including the battle at Nisseria, where Kennedy received a wound in his foot early in the morning of July 25th. He returned to the line before noon, where he took command of the regiment after Tweedsmuir was evacuated due to injuries from a mortar bomb. Major Kennedy became acting Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy, and not for the last time. Okay, next slide. So this is where it gets even weirder.
Yeah, it starts to get weird.
Yeah. So after crossing the Straits of Messina into Italy at the beginning of September, 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade and the rest of 8th Army headed north, driving the Germans ahead of them. In early October, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment stopped for a rest near Campobasso in the center of Italy. Kennedy was back to being a major. Lord Tweedsmuir was in command once more, having recovered from his injuries. Okay, so there in the center, I highlighted Campobasso, so you can kind of see more or less where they are. They are northwest of the Foggia airfield and northeast from Naples. So kind of halfway up there.
Yep.
All right, next one. On October 12th, Kennedy was out scouting with a couple of other men ahead of an attack on Campobasso. Sent out as liaison between the Hasty Peas and the RCR, he caught up to the RCR late in the morning. When shelling became heavy, an RCR officer suggested that they travel near a row of trees to be away from the road. Unfortunately, there were several Germans who had the same idea, advancing along the same path, and Kennedy and the other men were taken prisoner. The war diary, the Hasty Peas war diary for that day reads, "It is believed that an enemy patrol must have captured him. He didn't show up for supper tonight anyway."
Sorry.
I know. You gotta love Canadian war diaries. They're just cute.
They are all over the place.
Mm-hmm. The regiment was very concerned, actually, for Kennedy's safety. He was much beloved by the men of his regiment, always looking out for their welfare as best he could and scouting ahead wherever possible to see what threats may lie in their path. During the next week, they dug up 4 graves to check if the person within was Kennedy, which illustrates the intensity of their anxiety. But Howard Graham, 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion Brigadier General, was more sanguine. He recalls his response as this, quote, "Knowing Bert as I did, I recall saying to my brigade major, I bet even money Bert will be back with us before long." Thanks, Lorelei. So, next slide. What befell Bert Kennedy after he became a POW? He told his story to Canadian journalist Gregory Clark, who wrote it up for the Toronto Star and the Owen Sound Sun-Times. Clark called it one of the most strange and harrowing experiences any Canadian has suffered in the war. Clark asked Kennedy his reaction on being taken prisoner, to which Kennedy replied, "I had often thought of being wounded or killed. I'd never dreamed of being captured. And my instant thought was, this can't happen to me." Yeah. I was completely dazed and bewildered. I don't recall ever having been knocked so speechless and numb in my life. Kennedy was taken to a house used as a headquarters and questioned by a German captain using bits of English and bits of French. When asked when the thought of escaping first entered his mind, Kennedy replied, "Oh, immediately." But he was forced to wait for his opportunity. 4 days later, after being moved around and questioned further, though he said treated well by his captors, Kennedy was put on the back of a truck heading towards Rome, bound for Germany and a POW camp. This was October 16th. The day was wet and unpleasant, and Kennedy watched as the guards drew closer to the covered front of the back of the truck. He conversely moved back inch by inch until he was quite near the open end. As the day grew dusky, he knew he was going to have to make his move. When the truck slowed to go around a bend, Kennedy hurled himself from the back of the truck and landed running. He dived through a thorn hedge with some damage to my bald head, he said, and lay full length in a stream among the reeds and long grass. The guards fortunately gave up after a little while, and the truck drove away. Still, Kennedy lay doggo in the stream for some time in case a guard had remained behind. When it became fully dark, he got up and headed into the hills. For 3 weeks, Kennedy was on the run. After a few days, exhausted, starving, and cold, he took refuge in a barn owned by an Italian peasant farmer. The farmer discovered him there and gave him a much-needed refuge for a few days. A German soldier came to the door of the farmhouse one evening, but Kennedy hid under the bed while the farmer gave the soldier some food and convinced him to go away. Kennedy knew if the soldier had found him hiding there, the whole lot of them would have been shot and the house burned. It was an enormous chance the farmer took. He even gave Kennedy some ragged clothes and a little money, and accompanied him on a train to get him as close to his home regiment as possible. It was an incredible, selfless act. And I should mention, my research has shown me that it was far from the only time that Italian peasants helped Allied evaders. That's a whole another project. Amazing what they did. Yes, I agree. We need a Bert Kennedy movie. I'm trying to think who would play Bert. Anyway.
Yeah.
Kennedy hiked on, turning for help to other Italian country people where possible and finding kindness. He finally got to a spot close to the battle lines where he joined a group of 7 other evaders, including a British lieutenant from the Sherwood Foresters who'd been taken prisoner in Tobruk. Lieutenant Fred Fisher had lost his glasses, without which he was next to blind, so Kennedy guided him back to Vanafro through enemy lines in daylight. An American patrol took charge of them there. Kennedy borrowed a jeep from the Americans and drove himself back to the Hasty Peas headquarters at Castro Peñano. The Hasty Peas referred to as Castle Pigface, which is kind of nasty, but anyway.
Well, of course they did.
Yeah, that's the way they were. So that was Sunday, November 7th. So that's the next one. Next slide, please. I want to say about this wonderful
Yeah.
illustration. This is from my friend Matt Barrett, who is a historian.
Yep. He's been on the channel twice himself. Yep.
And he also is a graphic novelist. So he did this wonderful drawing of Bert Kennedy returning, and I think on the left of the picture is Farley Mowat.
Okay. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. Looks like
But,
him.
yeah. So, and in this is the typed bit is from the War Diary, and you can see right in the center of that there's a line that says, and it's in bold, "Ack Kennedy returned to us today." So they were very, very happy to have him back. So
sorry, before we continue question here in multiple ways, when they say the Jeep was borrowed, was it borrowed or stolen?
with yeah, no, there it was with permission.
I would say I figured they probably would, especially for someone of such a high rank.
Yeah, no, it was no problem. They knew
This is an interesting question, if that's okay, Norma, before we continue. Yeah, why hold that there?
His name was Albert Arnett Kennedy. So his initials were AA Kennedy. So, but one of his nicknames was Ack.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I call him Bert. A lot of people call him Bert.
Yeah.
But they also, I guess, his men called him Ack. So.
Yeah, makes sense for a war zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good point from.
And well, I think at first it was, "Who the hell are you?"
Well, probably.
They hadn't recognized him at first. They didn't. He was so gaunt and so dirty.
Yeah.
But they soon understood who it was, and they were pretty happy.
Yeah.
Upon arrival, he demanded to see Colonel Tweedsmuir. The commanding officer was sick in bed with jaundice, hepatitis, but Kennedy had to speak to him first. Kennedy was offered a period of leave to recover from his arduous journey. He'd lost at least 15 pounds that he couldn't afford to lose, but he refused, asking only for a new uniform. The next day, the desperately ill Tweedsmuir was taken to hospital, and Kennedy once more took over command of the regiment. Again, he became an acting lieutenant colonel. There was to be no respite for Kennedy. The effect of his return on the men of his regiment was electrifying. Kennedy's determination to fight on with his men instead of taking leave won him even more of their respect and devotion. Kennedy was soft-spoken but tough, and the men he commanded were inspired by his example. Okay, next slide.
Before we continue,
yeah,
not personal, but I don't think so.
No,
if you're related, I didn't think so.
I wish. No, Howard Graham was from over in the Trenton area. And he was he was commanded the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment in the militia. He was actually a lawyer.
Yep.
But he was in the First World War as well. His book is Citizen and Soldier, well worth a read. If you're interested in what it was like to be an officer from the militia, he was brigadier. So yeah, good guy. Whoops, there goes everything.
Oh, yeah, that happens. Yeah, been there many times.
Oh yeah. Well, my lovely kangaroo.
Oh yeah, we can take a wallop.
Okay, so.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, next.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, so we're moving on a little bit, another month. Yep. In December of 1943, the Canadians were commanded to take Ortona as part of Montgomery's plan to get to Rome via a left hook from the Adriatic coast. In the advance towards this coastal town, they had to cross the Morrow River. So if you see on this map, you see where it says 5th December, Stirling Castle, right in there. That was the Morrow River crossing, was where it's just where that arrow crosses that river. So
Very long hair.
Yeah. So in the winter, that was no easy feat. The river was running high with very muddy banks, and being at the bottom of a ravine that was observed by the enemy, crossing the Morro River was incredibly dangerous. The Morro danger is probably a Freudian slip. The Hasty Peace war diarist for December 5th stated laconically, "Enemy artillery is very active hereabouts." First, the IB knew they were in for a tough fight, and it was going to be tougher than they realized because the enemy had brought in fresh, fit, rested troops, and the Canadians were anything but fresh and rested. On December 5th, the Hasty Peas were ordered to take over a position held by the British 78th Division on the South Ridge near the mouth of the Morro River, about 4 miles south of Ortona. Kennedy received orders to cross the river that night in darkness with no opportunity for reconnaissance and no preliminary bombardment. Major General Vaux wanted to surprise the Germans. The attack was meant as a diversionary tactic to draw enemy attention away from simultaneous attacks, the Seaforth Highlanders on San Leonardo and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry on Via Rogati. That's about the last thing you want to be in a war, is go and be a diversion.
Especially in that territory.
Yeah. Anyway. There would, Kennedy knew, be no artillery, no armored support, no bridges were available to allow tanks to cross the river. It would be flesh, not steel, going up against the German guns. Frantic, he sent Farley Mowat, his intelligence officer, ahead to scout for possible crossing points and to try and see where the German guns were. Mowat found a possible fording spot at a sandbar, so at 2200 hours, No. 7 platoon of A Company headed out. The plan was for them to hold a firm defensive position until the rest of A Company could arrive. Then they were to sneak up the valley side to the ridgeline. Kennedy's plan was to send the rest of the battalion's line units in once A Company was established there. Then a pioneer company would descend to see if a tank crossing could be established. Well, you can imagine what happened. Due to a heavy German response and most of A Company being unable to travel up to the ridgeline due to a sheer cliff being in the way, remember, no reconnaissance, the first attack failed. Kennedy called for a withdrawal. The war diarist noted if the object of the operation was to create a diversion, it was eminently successful. Enemy guns in our sector fretted frenetically throughout the night. Kennedy was not defeated. He had an idea for an approach that, if it worked, could give the Canadians a bridgehead that they could hold. Plus, they might be able to seize the junction of the Coast Highway and the San Leonardo Road. He went to Brigadier General Howard Graham and pitched it to him, and Graham gave him the go-ahead. At 1340 on December 6th, an artillery barrage began and lasted 20 minutes. At 1400, Kennedy put the Hasty Peas across at the same ford as the previous night. At least now they knew the terrain. C Company was to establish a bridgehead, and D Company was to attack through it. Withering fire from the enemy caused the attack to lose steam, but Kennedy sent D Company in. But contact with D Company was lost. The tanks that were supposed to be in support were mired in mud, and Kennedy, knowing the German tanks would soon be showing up, ordered a withdrawal. C Company was able to make it back, but D Company didn't get the order. Kennedy was anxious, thinking D Company had been wiped out. But then the fog cleared, and Kennedy saw something miraculous. D Company had penetrated German positions, and the Germans had retreated. Never one to waste an opportunity, Kennedy himself led A and B companies and a carrier platoon across the river. Enemy fire sprang back to life then, and retreating was impossible. Kennedy ordered his men to dig in on the reverse slope of the river valley, where they were mostly safe from enemy fire. A desperate night followed. Pouring rain and heavy enemy fire kept the Hasty Peas pinned down. As December 7th dawned, they saw an apocalyptic scene. In the gray morning, the soldiers looked out of their holes at a landscape resembling historical photographs of the no man's land of the Great War. There was still no tank support. Despite their best efforts, the tanks were mired in mud. Kennedy was called back to HQ for an orders group and was told that the tiny salient the Hasty Peas had created had to be held. It was to be the starting point for a major brigade assault. The war diary records several attempted counterattacks by the Germans, all driven back by the exhausted but determined Canadians. Okay, next slide. On December 8th, after a night of frantic preparations, a major artillery bombardment on San Leonardo began at 15:30 hours. This was followed by 2 days of hard fighting by 1st CIB. They broke through the Morrow River line, and Hasty Peas headquarters received messages from Howard Graham and from Montgomery, congratulating the regiment on seizing and holding the bridgehead that had made it all possible. And this is the recommendation for Kennedy's DSO. So next slide. For his leadership under fire in this action, Kennedy was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Everybody can read that for yourselves. Just talks about how he moved from company to company, inspiring and encouraging his weary men and not giving up an inch of ground. His personal courage, aggressive leadership, calm judgment has maintained this important ground and inflicted grievous damage upon the enemy. On December 10th, Bert Kennedy was taken to Rear Battalion HQ, sick with jaundice. It is easy to imagine how very exhausted he was and how burdened by the difficult decisions he'd been forced to make in the previous 5 days. But Kennedy refused to be evacuated. While he recuperated, Brigadier Graham came by to let Kennedy know that he was once again a lieutenant colonel, and this time for keeps. Kennedy remained at Battalion HQ until December 19th, when he came to San Leonardo and once more took the reins of command. Next slide, please. So this is having to do with Ortona. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment weren't in Ortona proper. They were trying to hold, trying to capture a road to prevent the enemy from getting supplies in or getting out. So on December 23rd, 4 days after coming back into the line after his illness, Kennedy was again leading his men into the thick of fighting. He was, quote, weak but feisty as ever, unquote. As the Canadians approached Ortona, German resistance was fierce. Mortar bombs and machine gun bullets were a constant threat. The Germans in Ortona were vulnerable to having their supply line cut if the Canadians could block the roads into Ortona from the north and from the west. The Hasty Peas were directed to take a ridge line overlooking the road from Tolo into Ortona. Unfortunately, heavy rain and the many vineyards strung with wire somewhat limited tank support for this offensive because the tanks would get tangled up in this wire. Okay, next slide. Despite the difficulties, the tanks and infantry made good progress for the first 1,000 yards, but then they ran into the German defenses, manned not by Panzer Grenadiers, but by the elite troops of the German 1st Parachute Division, the Fallschirmjäger. The A and C companies of the Hasty Peas were stopped 100 yards from their objective. Kennedy took B Company along with intelligence officer Farley Mowat and led them forward to bolster the faltering attack. Mowat recalled in And No Birds Sang, the explosions of our own and German shells pounded hideously inside my skull, yet Kennedy seemed unaware. Not once did he dive for cover, or even so much as hunch his shoulders when the grating scream of an incoming projectile warned of imminent destruction. Kennedy was a dim shape in a dim world, plodding steadily onwards. Seeing their commander's icy resolve and courage, the men of the Hasty Peas once again began to advance. By midday, they had achieved their objective on the ridge line, holding a small salient through which other regiments could pass. Kennedy walked among his men, ignoring the very real possibility a sniper would target him, and kept the morale high. And from Farley Mowat's The Regiment, He wrote, with indefatigable patience and calmness, Kennedy moved from company to company, reassuring the uncertain and reiterating his thematic phrase, "Take it easy, lads, no matter what happens, we'll look after you." By we, he meant the regiment, and so great was the spirit of the regiment that no man doubted him. Until December 29th, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment held their ridge in brutal winter weather and with almost constant shelling by the enemy. It was Colonel Kennedy who held them together. So there's a bit from And No Birds Sang. So talking about it's just a little interchange that he had with Kennedy. So next slide. If it wasn't for Farley Mowat's memoirs, The Regiment and No Birds Sang, we would know very little about Lieutenant Colonel A.A. Kennedy and his consistently courageous leadership in Italy. After Ortona, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment rested and recovered for a spell. Mentions of Kennedy became scarce. We know he was given his DSO by Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese, which is this picture. This is from
Commander of 8th Army.
Yeah, this is from the book Duffy's Regiment.
Okay, yeah.
And we know he was wounded quite seriously by a German S-mine on April 8th, 1944, and evacuated back to England. Following evacuation to the UK, Kennedy served as an instructor at 3 Wing, Canadian School of Infantry, giving new recruits the benefit of his experience and leadership. He was given command of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders in February 1945, but was relieved of command in April. That's a whole nother story that's I'm working on with a friend. So watch this space.
Yeah, we'll once we get, well, hopefully I can help a little bit. But once you get through those details, which we think we're on the right track. I think you are.
So there's a whole,
we'll have you back.
There, but
oh yeah, it's a wild story again. This guy has had so many episodes that are just mind-boggling. It's
so next slide. So this is from after VE Day, just a bit from the War Diary. Shows that Colonel Kennedy, former CO and an old friend of the Padre, was an honored guest at the dinner. So he was back to visit. After the war ended and the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment was waiting in the Netherlands to be demobilized and sent home, the Hasty Peas War Diarist records that Kennedy showed up to some events, including a dinner in honor of the regiment's beloved Padre Goforth on June 16th, 1945. Okay, next slide.
Oh, it's so steep in there.
After the war, Kennedy returned to Owen Sound and commanded the Grey and Simcoe Foresters until January 1954. So the picture of commanding officer raps on door, I was a bit confused by this, but the volunteer that I spoke to at the Grey and Simcoe Foresters Museum said they were trooping the colors.
Okay.
And you're supposed to knock on the door with a sword, but Bert didn't have a sword, so he used the butt of his pistol. I guess. So it's kind of cool.
That'll work.
His practice of looking after the men under his command continued in peacetime, and he was highly regarded by them all, officers and men alike. Colonel Lorne Williams, retired, who served under Kennedy, remarked with emotion, "I was privileged to know him." Kennedy also remained an honorary member of the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment and in close contact with officers of the other regiments with which they had served, including the Royal Canadian Regiment in London. He then served as a commissioner of Ontario Hydro for many years.
Yep.
Next.
Which is electricity to non-Canadians.
Yeah. Next slide.
Non-Ontarians, I guess.
So Albert Arnett Bert Kennedy died December 1981 at the age of 76. This is kind of an interesting story how we tracked this down. We didn't, Dave Alexander and I, we didn't know where Bert was buried.
Right.
So we knew he died in Collingwood, and that the funeral was being held in the town of Stayner. So one day I thought, well, what the heck, I'll try. So I emailed a funeral home in Stayner that was one that said that they'd been in business since 18-2, you know.
Yeah.
And I wrote to them and said, did you guys happen to be the funeral home that looked after this veteran's funeral? And they said, well, yeah, actually we were. He got back to me within an hour. And
Oh, wow.
And that his ashes, he was cremated, and his ashes are interred in the family plot in the cemetery in Owen Sound.
Okay.
Which is the same cemetery that David Curry is in, that Tommy Holmes is in, and that Billy Bishop is in, right?
Yep. Yeah, a lot of Canadian military history people have come down through Owen Sound for I'm not really sure what reason, but it seems to be the way.
So that it says in his obituary, Bill Granger of Owen Sound served under him and said he was one of the best. Mr. Justice Robert Rutherford, who also served with them, said he was a very fine officer who was highly regarded by his troops. And so next slide. So his ashes are interred in the Kennedy family plot in Greenwood Cemetery. So thanks to Dave and the funeral home in Stayner for helping us track that down.
Yep.
So all there is to show, this is just a little plaque in the ground, or a little stone in the ground, and that's all there is.
Huh.
You know, it seems to me there should be something a little better.
Yeah.
For someone who was such a hero. Next slide. There. And that is all.
There we go. So thank you, Norma. That was great. If anyone has questions, now is a good time. I'll start with one if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
Let me go back here. So this might take a little bit of explaining, but you said speaking about his background, right, where Kennedy comes from and his father's business and things like that. And for those who don't know, Owen Sound is on Lake Huron. So obviously
Virgin Bay. Yeah, it's
Virgin Bay, Lake Huron. They're the same thing. Technically, they're different, but they're not. They're connected. Anyway, they're connected. Anyway, big, open, lots of area. So I assume the family was doing well based on the factory. Why is the gravestone not as big as others? Because typically in Ontario cemeteries, which I've been in a lot of, the families of the well-to-do families typically have bigger things. Is that because there's a family plot there? Is that why?
Yes. Yeah. There's a family stone that just Kennedy.
Yeah. Okay.
And these are the various family members have these in the ground. But I just think that somebody who was a veteran, who was a DSO, who was a leader of men, really should have had something, or should have now. Yeah. This is something a little bit clearer to show who he was and what he achieved. Something will make people go, "Oh, this was a warrior."
Yeah, stop and think. I mean, there is things to do that in for like separate plaques and everything like that, but it's quite a process to do through the province. So maybe that's something we could look into. But here's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to this one. Is there any public building, infrastructure, anything named after him?
Nope.
Nothing. Okay.
Nothing.
And Steve's bringing up maybe the idea of a last post, but they do more of marking those who have nothing. So yeah, that's not really their thing. But
it kind of goes to who Bert was as a person. I think that he was a humble guy. You know? Mm-hmm. He didn't think he did anything special.
Yeah, I mean, you get that because I helped you again with some of that research. You get a lot of that from the digging, because I went down the rabbit hole of Ontario Hydro, which was interesting because I didn't expect to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
because it's one of the most well documented, I don't know, public utilities I've ever seen. Like their archive is wild of what they have. But it's quite wild that they have so much going on there. But and this is actually a good question from Pete, who's done a lot of local research himself. Is the Legion involved in this in any way, or they got anything at all?
I think there's some plans afoot, perhaps,
Okay.
or with the Grey and Simcoe Foresters
Right.
group that they may. I'm hoping if I pester them enough, whine loud enough, maybe they'll
Yeah.
get something going that show, that will. He needs to be. I mean, he doesn't need to be. I think we as a society, we as a community, need to honor him.
Yeah.
I don't think it doesn't glorify war. It glorifies courage.
Yeah.
And
I mean, we see that a
selfless,
lot.
which like, because
Yeah.
this was.
We see that a lot here in Canada. Sorry, let's just jump in there, but we see that a lot. And
Yeah.
I see it in all kinds of ways, and it makes no sense to me. But people saying anything is somehow glorifying war, or it represents the bad things that happened, and all that stuff. And I mean, I fight that all the time, and it's a bigger issue I see in Canadian society. But it's such an interesting story that someone like Kennedy, who's probably had to have been well known in the community, having connections to the militia and the father's business, and all of those people that you see, all those lawyers and judges and everybody he knows afterwards, just kind of not disappear, but because he's in Mowat's work, but that's pretty much it. So
that's pretty much it. Yeah. And, this is typical, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's just an indicative of just
how we suck at commemoration. To just go back to what we were talking about, how he was on the front line for 9 months, but it was an intense 9 months. I was down at Wilfrid Laurier University's Laurier Center this week, and I found this quote from a book called Crerar's Lieutenants.
Yes.
By Jeff Hayes.
Yep.
And he wrote, Terry Kopp notes that the Army doctrine placed an enormous weight on junior officers, quote, who were expected, indeed required, to lead from the front.
Yep.
But what exactly did that entail? It meant leaving hospital early so that one's company or platoon would not be led by someone with less experience. Well, that's what he did. It meant lowly lieutenants taking over a company after all other officers were killed or wounded. It meant sharing extra candy and rations with men who had the grim task of digging graves. It meant keeping the men from getting windy, that is, nervy, by sitting with them in their slit trenches throughout long days and nights. It meant showing coolness under fire. He certainly did that. And ensuring the men had tea. It meant little sleep. So, 9 months, that 9 months was, really pretty much enough for a lifetime, I'd say.
Well, I mean, yeah, sorry not to jump in too much, but it's just, like we said, his is so, other word to use, action-packed with, fighting through, Sicily, which most of us know was intense. Covering a sorrow is so hard to convey what that was like. I mean, it's obviously we're not there, but just getting, even when the details you see them from the primary documents, it's still hard to convey.
3-foot cliff, practically straight up, dark.
Yeah.
Trying to be absolutely silent.
Yeah.
While carrying what equipment they needed. Plus, one guy had a radio on his back. They had the radio on a mule, and the mule died from the exertion, so they had to carry the.
Up the cliff. And for those who don't know, because Hastings, it's Eastern Ontario, so it's flat. There's nothing around to prep you, even in the smallest possible way, or if you like that kind of thing. It doesn't exist. Still doesn't exist. So it's just mind-boggling to me that that they were able to do that. And well, I mean, Farrell Mowat says, I don't know how I did it. He says it multiple times. He has no idea how he was able to do it.
So. He called it every man performing their own private miracle.
And there's just one thing I think we could probably end on here and maybe have some, action items, so to speak, is like how you mentioned, right? Because Billy Bishop is from Owen Sound himself. So it's fighting against, and mythology is, I think, even putting it a little nicely, of what he didn't do. Most of it's made up. Anyway, of fighting against that, especially in such an area where Bishop has such a huge control of all of that sort of war hero thing. And
the Bishop, now that's a good idea, actually, coming around to it from the side. the Bishop Museum, the Billy Bishop Museum they do displays and exhibits having to do with things other than Billy, things other than the First World War. I wonder if they'd be interested in some kind of a display about Bert.
Do you think? Sorry, this just came into my head too. Do you think because again, I don't want to give too much away, but because he fought in Italy, right? As we know, right? Italy takes a backseat, especially even in Canada. I mean, we kind of shove it off to the side, which is interesting given the units involved. And his, we'll say, brief sojourn in Northwest Europe. Do you think that kind of plays into it a little as well of why he's not remembered? Because a lot of the DSO stuff and higher gallantry awards from Normandy get some attention, and everyone's like, "Who is this guy?" So do you think that maybe plays into it a little bit?
Yeah, the fact that it was Italy and not, storming the beach of Juno Beach at Normandy might.
Yeah.
But I mean, even those stories, the people like the Dalton brothers, on Juno Beach, or, even that stuff gets lost.
Yeah, true.
It gets lost in the, but Omaha.
Yeah,
right?
Don't get started on that, but
so
that's people like you that are keeping this stuff going, because otherwise, we wouldn't know. Because, well, Sean puts it expertly here, excellently, expertly, whatever those great words, is the VC's got all the attention.
Yeah. Well, I mean, who knows that David Curry's there too?
True.
He was a VC, and I don't know, it just doesn't have the same impact somehow.
Well, he wasn't from Owen Sound. I think that probably plays into it, because that's
I think he was a West.
Yeah, he was from the West, and then they lived in Ottawa because he was Sergeant at Arms in Parliament, but his wife was from Owen Sound, so that's why he's buried there. But it's just, I don't know. I think it's the same thing. I don't want to go over and over again, but it's the same issues we face with Canadian military history, and that apathy and that sometimes outright resistance to people of wanting to talk about it in that way. So I don't know. I mean, I know it's not easy, but this is something that could be a book. No easy feat, but I mean, it's definitely would be an interest to, I think, a lot of people if this was marketed the way it should be done, but what we don't do in Canada, for what I just said, and all that stuff. And and Dave, who knows well about this more than probably anybody else, is these are small units that don't have a lot of money.
Right. I mean, the Hasty Peas Museum is open one day a week.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's even open, to be honest.
Tuesdays. You can go on Tuesdays.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to be mean or anything. It's just I'm surprised it's still open. I mean, like the RCR can keep going because they're big in Toronto and all that stuff. But I mean, it's tough. But it's the same issues we've talked about over and over again here. It's what we're facing and trying to do this stuff. Well, I wish Rick was right, but the stories that get told are the ones that get best funded, supported. I just have found that not to be the case, unfortunately.
I mean, one of those.
I get what he's saying, but it's just it's hard to even break in some of the stories that used to be extremely well known in Canada and then just disappear.
Well, Alan Arnett MacLeod.
Yeah,
his story was very well known in the 30s, and now it's virtually unknown. So
I don't know. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So thanks again, Norma. I appreciate it.
Watched, and please remember Bert. Yes,
well, we definitely will, and hopefully you find that piece that's missing. That piece. I don't want to say anymore.
I'll come back with my friend Matt, if we get that sorted and talk about that, because it'll be a whole interesting other thing.
Well, we could have you both on to talk about it, and because Matt's been on, and he talked about his book about the courts martial and all that connected to officers in both world wars. So that'll be a fascinating way, because he's got that broader understanding, and you got that deep down, real good detail. And I think, again, I want to tease here. I'm doing this very purposely. I think the piece that you're waiting for is probably going to give you the detail that you need to bring that story through.
Yeah.
Depending on what gets redacted or not. We'll see.
I was surprised when I got Bert's. It took me 8 months to get Bert's service record. But I was surprised that nothing was redacted. Nothing.
Yeah. So hopefully the other one, I don't want to say anymore, but yeah, anyway, so everyone, thanks for watching and listening to Norma and talking about this important story. And hopefully we can do a little more for this, and maybe we can look into some stuff for commemoration and then get everybody to jump on board with that as well. But other than that, check out the Black Watch video right after this if you can. Create a little watch session for me to get some more traction going, especially for a new video. So other than that, everyone enjoy the rest of your Saturday and your weekend, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,